Before we get started, we just want to say thank you to Viltrox for sending us the lens for review. But as usual, we're not paid to say anything besides our own opinions, and Viltrox does not get to see this video before it is published. This video is also lit by the WeLight Ninja 20B video light. This is a very powerful LED light that is good for different projects. Definitely check it out on the Viltrox official website for more information. Let's get straight to the point. What you're looking at is the footage we took with the Viltrox 13mm F1.4 APSC Sony E mount lens. Everything was recorded with a Sony A7 IV in 1080p APS-C mode. We were very impressed by the image quality and the color rendition of the lens. Everyone was right. This lens is very sharp and fun to use. Yes, it is not razor sharp when it is at f1.4, but definitely sharp enough for our taste. Just so you know, we tested the Viltrox 13mm F1.4 lens on the full-frame Sony A7 IV, so the photos are around 14 megapixels but still sharp enough and not clinically sharp. First of all, we don't test the lens with charts and graphs. We prefer taking it out to take real-world photos and videos, and we have no complaints at all in terms of sharpness. Also, we don't really pixel peep, so 14 megapixels is definitely good enough for us. By the way, most people will probably use this lens for landscape and astrophotography, but we don't really do those, so we will show you how we use this lens for our creative purposes. We took this lens out on a photo walk with our friends, and surprisingly, we love using this wide-angle lens for portrait photos. On an APS-C camera, 13mm is around 20mm full-frame equivalent, which can be considered as ultra-wide, and it is definitely very stylistic for portrait photography. If you have used a 35mm or 50mm lens before, they are pretty close to what we can see with our eyes in terms of compression, so the images coming out of those lenses look pretty normal to us. With a 20mm lens, things are going to look different. That's why everyone likes it a lot. When you're taking photos with an ultra-wide angle lens like the Viltrox 13mm F1.4, you have to pay a lot of attention at where you want to put the focus on because everything will be drawn to the center of the frame, and the center of the frame is usually the least distorted or stretched. When I was using this lens during the photo walk, I prefer taking the picture from a lower angle and point the camera up because it makes your subject look taller, and that is the angle that you see a lot in fashion photography because it is more flattering. When you put the lens at eye level or even higher, your subject's face will look rounder, especially when you are very close to the subject. But it doesn't mean that it is not a good look. It is definitely more stylistic than the lower angle. If you use it creatively, it can be a fantastic style to use. With the Viltrox 13mm F1.4, because of its ultra-wide nature, a lot of things in the frame will become leading lines. That will help guiding the audience towards the center of the frame, so it is much easier if you put the subject in the center or at least the center line of the photo. With a longer lens, let's say a 70mm lens, it is more difficult to use leading line because of how close the background is being pulled to the subject, but it blurs out the background much more than a wide-angle lens, so it is definitely a different look. I would say ultra-wide-angle lenses are more for stylistic photography and longer lenses are more for normal portraits. I will definitely suggest getting both focal lengths for different looks. Another unique characteristic of ultra-wide-angle lenses is the ability to utilize foreground elements to create a sense of depth. If you can't find any foreground elements, using the subject's hands will work too. We even tried using someone else's hands to frame the subject and it worked very well. As you can see in the sample photos, the Viltrox 13mm F1.4 lens at 14 megapixels on the Sony A7 IV is definitely sharp enough for a lot of purposes, especially when we mainly view our photos on smartphones or tablets nowadays. But if you need to print the photos, let's say to a poster or bigger size, you will need higher megapixels. I think the lens is sharp enough to handle that. For videos, I have said it multiple times before, I prefer softer lenses than clinically sharp modern day lenses. And the Viltrox 13mm is definitely on the more pleasing and softer side, and I really like it. When it comes to subject isolation, yes, an ultra-wide-angle lens is definitely not going to give you the same effect as a tighter lens, but the Viltrox 13mm is a f1.4 lens. Even with the 1.5 times APS-C crop, it will still give you around f2.1 equivalent subject isolation. As you can see in the photos, there's definitely a clear separation between the subject and the background. The roll off from focus to out of focus area on the Viltrox 13mm lens is very smooth. We actually prefer a smoother roll off instead of a very 3D pop. It looks much more organic and less digital. Also, the blurry background does not look too busy to us, which is awesome. Since we're talking about background blur, you can still achieve reasonable amount of that with this lens, just not a lot because it is ultra wide. Just be careful not to get too close to the subject or else everything will get distorted very quickly. Talking about getting close to the subject, the minimum focus distance of this lens is pretty impressive, at least when we're taking portrait photos. My friends kept asking is it really okay when I asked them to get much closer to the lens. So when you're using an ultra wide angle lens, try to get closer, like much closer than closer. By the way, the bokeh balls on this lens is very round and they don't have much onion rings inside even at f1.4. So overall, you will get a very clean background blur, which is very impressive coming from a budget lens. Since this is an ultra wide angle lens, the bokeh balls are not going to be super big even at its widest aperture. Also, there's a greenish purplish ring around the bokeh balls, so keep that in mind if that bothers you. When it comes to distortion, yes, this lens has a pretty strong barrel distortion and pincushion distortion at the same time. I call it the dumpling distortion because it shapes like a dumpling, but the in-camera and Lightroom lens correction will fix most of it. Same thing with vignetting. When you're using this lens at f1.4 to f2.8, you will see a very strong vignette at the corners if you have the in-camera correction turned off. When you're using it at f4, most of the vignetting are gone. Correct me if I'm wrong, I think most of the cameras nowadays have distortion and vignette correction in camera, so I would say keep those features turned on when using this lens, although I don't know why you would turn them off unless it is a creative choice. By the way, the distortion and vignetting problems is barely noticeable when you are filming video with this lens because the usual video aspect ratio is 16:9, so the top and bottom are cut off anyway, so for videos, not a big problem. But when it comes to distortion, an ultra-wide angle lens is definitely a specialty lens for videos. It is definitely a creative choice to choose such a wide-angle lens. This lens is definitely good for vlogging or snorri cam. When it comes to chromatic aberration, to be honest with you, I did not notice it that much during our photo session and even when I was filming sample footage. You really have to point the lens to a super high contrast area and turn off chromatic aberration correction to see them. Again, for photos, not sure why you would turn off those features. We do notice a very obvious bright spot of ghosting when we point this lens somewhat close to a bright light source, for example, the sun. There's a tiny purple dot showing up from time to time. The lens hood did not really help with that. The contrast is pretty well maintained in these situations though, so that's great. Since this is an autofocus lens, it works very well with the Sony A7 IV autofocus system. Eye autofocus works very accurately and focusing speed is very quick as well. We are always impressed by how accurate autofocus is on third-party Sony lenses. The focus breathing is also very minimal, almost none when you are pulling focus during a video. This is absolutely amazing because a bad focus breathing lens will zoom in and out when you pull focus, and it is super distracting. The Viltrox 13mm F1.4, no problem at all. When this lens is focusing, the focus motors are very quiet, but you can still feel the motors a little bit from time to time. I think they are doing a very great job already. If you need to record audio, just try not to use an on-camera microphone just in case. This lens is fully made out of metal, even the lens hood, which is very surprising and nice. The only thing I wish Viltrox can work on their future lenses is to include weather sealing, because this lens does not have it. It has a declicked aperture ring, which is very handy for video work, and I confirmed that it will smoothly change the aperture instead of stepping, which is perfect. If you're trying to decide between this lens and its closest competition, which should be the new Sony 15mm F1.4 APSC lens, the Viltrox one is a lot wider for stylistic photos, and it is made of metal instead of plastic, and the Sony lens is almost double the price of the Viltrox. But of course, getting a Sony lens gives you weather sealing, more button controls on the lens, and maybe a sharper image. We don't know because we have never tested that lens, and maybe better autofocus, but at half of the price, the Viltrox lens is definitely not bad at all. That's it. Those are our thoughts on the Viltrox 13mm F1.4 Sony APS-C lens. We really love this lens because of the image quality and the ultra-wide angle perspective that brought us so much joy when using it. My friends love it too. Let us know what you think in the comment section below. Have you used an ultra-wide angle lens before? Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.